let's start. Another interesting week. So, lots of things happen.
Fascinating week.
Yeah, lots of things happen in the conflict of Ukraine conflict front. Let's go through them. The latest one, I think they just finished a meeting between US and Russia in Riyadh, right, in Saudi Arabia. What is your take on that? It seems to me it's more than just Ukraine, right? They talked about other things. So what's your feeling about the scope of the meeting and what they have achieved?
The scope of the meeting was in some ways very, very broad. And it's clear that they discussed the whole range of Russian American relations. But it's very important to separate that from what they actually agreed. The agreements were very limited. The agreements basically came down to two things. Well, actually, three things. Firstly, they're going to unblock measures to restrict each other's embassies in their respective countries. Now, this has been a long standing issue. The Russians have been bringing it up for years
Mhm.
that the Russian embassy in Washington, can barely work. It's very limited in the number of diplomats it has. Russia has no ambassador accredited to the United States at the moment, and funding. The embassy isn't able to use the American banking system. So
Mhm.
money has to be
Mhm.
brought in cash from Russia. The American embassy in Moscow faces identical restrictions. So this has been impossible. I mean, it's made it almost impossible for the two embassies to function. Well, it's been agreed that all that's going to be lifted. I mean, they will appoint ambassadors, they will lift the restrictions on new diplomats to bring up the embassies back to proper staffing levels, and they will end the banking restrictions. So that was one thing that was agreed. The Americans agreed that they would appoint a representative to speak to the Russians about Ukraine. That was the only agreement on Ukraine
Mhm.
that was actually reached, that the Americans would appoint a representative. And the Russians said that as soon as the Americans do that, and assessing how senior that person is, they will appoint someone um, of the same level. And apparently, there are to be expert groups to discuss other issues of US Russian relations going forward, including issues of sanctions and that sort of thing. But so, in terms of agreements, we're talking about a very limited set of agreements, and no agreement so far on a Putin Trump summit meeting. There was talk it might happen next week. But the Russians are saying it's more likely to happen now in March. There's clearly going to be work to do that, but obviously there's a lot of things to do. Um, but what happened in Riyadh goes well beyond what was agreed, because the Americans came and they wanted to talk with the Russians about lots of things. And clearly, the Americans want a full normalization. I mean, they made that very clear, a full normalization of relations with Russia. They want to reestablish full economic links. They want to find a route back so that sanctions can be lifted. I mean, they made this absolutely clear. So they want full normalization of relations with Russia, full dialogue with Russia on every conceivable issue. China, we'll come to that, Iran, all sorts of things. And they want, in order to get this relationship back, uh, um, working again, they want to see if something can be agreed to bring this
Mhm.
issue of the war in Ukraine to an end, or at least if that can't be done, at least to put it to one side. And apparently, a lot of the discussion was the Russians. A lot of the hours that were taken was the Russians going through the history of the conflict in Ukraine and
Mhm.
explaining it to the Americans, who were basically sitting there listening. So that was why the meeting lasted 4.5 hours. But fairly restricted meeting in terms of what was agreed. But the intention to re-establish a full relationship, a full dialogue with the Russians, was absolutely clear. Now, the Russians are talking about this with themselves. Lavrov has been talking to the Russian parliament. I mean, it's absolutely clear what the Americans ultimately want to do. And I think this has even been talked about in the British media. They judge themselves to be in full confrontation with China.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about this all the time. They want to transfer all their armies and fleets and air forces and all of those things to the Asia Pacific region. And they also want, as they say, to pull the Russians away from this dependence, as they like to call it, with China. Now, Lavrov has spoken today to the Russian parliament, and he's made it absolutely clear that that isn't going to happen. And I understand the Russians also said that over the course of the Riyadh meeting, that the relationship with China is simply not negotiable. I mean, they're not prepared to even talk about it.
One thing they talked about, the Chinese paid a lot of attention to this meeting, of course. I mean, everybody does. So the focus of China is for this meeting is that they did talk about want to work with Russia and also with Saudi. Now, the meeting is in Saudi is probably not just a coincidence. It seems like Trump does want to work with Saudi and with Russia about the oil market. So trying to lower the cost of the oil prices because Trump doesn't like inflation. I mean, nobody does. And he also very proud to always remind people that when he was president last time, the gas prices was much lower, which is true. Okay, after him, it did went up quite a bit. So he liked low oil prices, but also in Chinese view is possibly he's also trying to lower it so much that the Chinese EVs will encounter problems. So that's one way for him to counter China. Is there some elements of that?
Yes, I'm absolutely sure. I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but I think it's a very astute point, actually, and I think this is absolutely correct. Now, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons why it was held in Saudi Arabia was precisely the one that people are saying in China. By the way, on the Duran, we said exactly the same thing, and it's important to mention, by the way, that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's also Prime Minister and de facto ruler of the country, was there. I mean, he participated in those discussions. Trump absolutely wants to lower energy prices. He wants to lower energy prices because, as he rightly says, it's the route to bring down inflation. This is completely correct. And in order to do that, he needs to lift the sanctions on the Russians because the sanctions on Russian oil and gas are disrupting the efficient operation of global energy markets. This is absolutely true. And so he wants to do that in order to lower inflation costs in the United States. Inflation is rising again in the United States. It's worth saying. And obviously, talking to the two big oil and gas exporters, apart from the United States, which is Russia and Saudi Arabia, is logical in order to do that. About lowering prices to the point where Chinese EVs are no longer competitive. Well, I hadn't thought of that, but it would not surprise me in the slightest, given that despite the fact that Elon Musk, who heads Tesla, is stands at Trump's right hand. Trump has made it absolutely clear that he basically wants to return to fossil fuels. So he wants to reduce fossil fuel prices. He knows that the United States cannot produce EVs as efficiently as China can, and in the kind of volumes that China can. So I can entirely see why, in order to protect Detroit and the American car industry and all of that, he wants to lower energy costs to the point where EVs are no longer profitable or commercially viable, and the old American clunking gas using car industry is able to splutter along and survive. I cannot imagine that that's going to happen, by the way. And Putin some weeks ago made a very, very interesting point. when he discussed this whole question, and he said, look, Russia and America have the same interests in terms of energy, which is that we want prices to be low because we're both big manufacturers, prices of energy to be low because we're both big manufacturers, and we want that to help our manufacturing industry. So we don't want prices to be too high. We want them, fairly low. But on the other hand, we don't want them so low that it's no longer profitable to develop our oil and gas industries. So let's talk about that. Was what Putin said. So it doesn't seem to me from that comment that Putin has much interest in extinguishing Chinese EVs, which, by the way, are now penetrating the Chinese car market. And of course, as we know, the Russians, including the Russian motor vehicle manufacturers, are busy agreeing joint production and joint work on EVs with China. They're trying to attract investment there. But I can see that. I can imagine that in Trump's mind, if he can achieve that objective, that would be a good thing. As I said, he's not going to do it.
Yeah, that's actually my question, because I thought the whole idea about OPEC and OPEC Plus is to control the supply so the price doesn't go too low. Because if it's too low, it will hurt everybody, all the energy countries, right? So how low can it go, really?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the Saudis, of course, have a slightly different perspective here because they want the price to be relatively high. Firstly, because oil is their only major export. So, I mean, they're in a much weaker position. They don't have the diversified economies that Russia and America do. But beyond that, the Saudis are worried that soon we will be looking at a world where oil is, if not, oil would be a lot less important. So they're trying to build up some kind of high technology industrial base that will be there for the Saudis when oil has gone. And they have a massive investment program underway in order to do that. And in order to do it, they need the price of oil to be high because they need the money from the oil receipts to invest in all these projects that they're carrying out in Saudi Arabia, many of which, I should say, are investment projects very, very dear to MBS's own heart. So there is a tension. And historically, I mean, one of the things that the Biden people did, which infuriated the Saudis hugely, was that the Biden people and the G7 imposed a price cap on Russian oil. And MBS said, look, you can't possibly do this. The person who decides what the price of oil is me. You're not do something like that. You can't do that. And it caused significant tensions between MBS and the Saudis on the one hand, and the Americans and the Europeans on the other.
The other thing is that EV is not just energy efficient by itself. Turns out if you want to do high-tech stuff, a self-driving car, for example, it works much better with EVs versus the traditional fossil fuel type of cars. So you see, the dilemma Trump is facing is if he wants to protect the traditional U.S. automakers' jobs, he's pulling U.S. back technologically, right? Isn't it? So
this is absolutely correct. I mean, that is the danger of protectionism, is that what it does is that it insulates, it protects an industrial structure, which is gradually, as a result, going to become more and more obsolete. Now, I've actually witnessed that in Britain. I mean, in the 1930s, Britain, which had previously advocated free trade, adopted protectionism in a big way. It had a policy called imperial preference, whereby the British Empire became a kind of unit. It was providing raw materials to Britain, which provided the industrial base, which operated between high tariff walls, and which then exported the goods it made to the rest of the empire. It was very extractive, a very, very extractive system. The result was that by the 1950s, Britain had become an industrial museum. And I saw that. I mean, my earliest work as a lawyer was in industry. I mean, I did a lot of industrial work, and that meant going and visiting British engineering factories, which still existed in some number in the 1980s. And I was shocked by how out of date they were. I mean, it was not unusual to find machine tools in British engineering factories that dated from the 19th century. This was in the 1980s. So, I mean, it was completely obsolete. And of course, when Britain was forced to open up its economy completely, all of these factories and all of this plant collapsed because, I mean, it was so out of date that it couldn't function anymore. And that is the danger if it goes full speed on protectionism that the United States itself could face, especially given how concentrated in terms of its ownership the US auto industry has now become.